Real estate finance. This is going to be an overview of real estate finance. A lot of times when people, in fact, most of the time when people buy property, they don't have cash to pay the entire purchase price. So they have to borrow the money to buy the real property, whether you're talking about a house for individuals or companies, corporations acquiring property for their business interests. So how do they get the money? Well, they borrow the money, and the instrument we use, the legal document we use to borrow that money is called the promissory note. Sometimes it's called the real estate lien note because a lien is created on the property when the money is borrowed. Now the parties, there'll be several parties to this real estate lien note or to the promissory note. The maker, and that's going to be the borrower. Sometimes that person is called the payor because they will be the ones paying off the debt. But you have the maker of the note. They're the ones that sign and borrow the money. The payee will be the lender. They're the ones that will receive payment of the money. And then we have on many occasions someone called the holder. And this is going to be someone who receives the note from the payee somewhere down the line. There may be a situation where the payee says, you know, I don't want to be servicing this debt anymore. I don't want to be receiving the payments. I want to sell the note, get my money out of it, and let someone else receive all those payments. Well, that someone else is going to be the holder, sometimes called a holder in due course, but that's the holder of the note, and they receive transfer of it. Then on some occasions, we might have a transaction that's called a guarantee. And a guarantor is the person that signs a guarantee, and they're basically saying that they will pay the debt that belongs to someone else if that someone else, the maker, does not pay. If the maker doesn't pay, the guarantor will step up and pay it. And they're legally obligated to pay that. They're not a signer on the note, but they're guaranteeing the note. Most frequently, though, when you have another person that's helping to borrow the money rather than being a guarantor, the lending companies will say, no, we don't want you to be a guarantor. We want you to be a maker, a co-maker on the note. Now, once you've borrowed the money, what assurances are going to be that the borrower is going to pay it back? Lenders want collateral. So we create that collateral, that security interest in the real property, because that's usually what the collateral is going to be, will be the real property that you're purchasing. That's created, that security interest is created with what we call a security instrument. Now, and what they're going to be called differs from state to state. Some states are called a mortgage. So other states, like Texas, they're called the deed of trust. Or in other states, it's the same concept, but it's called a trust deed rather than deed of trust. Same thing. Some states it's called a security deed. Well, let's look at these very quickly. The mortgage simply creates an encumbrance on the property. There's a long English common law history on where mortgages came from, but essentially what it does, it creates a lien or an encumbrance on the property. Well, then you have the deed of trust. It does the same thing, but it does it by actually transferring the purchaser of the property in this transaction now becomes a grantor in this deed of trust, and they transfer the title to a trustee. So a third party who's going to own the property, but only with respect to foreclosing on it in the event the debt is not paid. So that's all the trustee can do is foreclose if it's not paid. Otherwise, the owner of the property essentially is the owner of the property. Security, very similar to that, is a security deed. Security deed, rather than transferring it to a third-party trustee, and by the way, that trustee up here works in the best interest of, and frequently is an employee of, the lender, or maybe the lender's attorney. But security deed works the same way, except instead of sending it to a trustee, you send it, you deed the property right back to the lender. So, you know, the old joke about, hey, you own your house? No, the bank owns it. Well, that's essentially how it happens. You're deeding the property back to the bank or back to a trustee who's working for the bank. And once again, with a security deed, if you don't pay the debt, the bank or the finance company, the mortgage company can sell the property. One last word on this. All three of these instruments are typically generically referred to as the mortgage, regardless of what state you're in. So what are the requirements of a mortgage? Well, they're going to be the same as a deed. You've got to have competent parties. You've got to have words of conveyance. You know, I grant and convey to the trustee or back to the bank. You've got to have a property description. You have to describe what property that this security interest attaches to that's going to potentially be foreclosed on. You hope not, but it's a possibility, so you have to describe that property. The document has to be properly executed, properly signed, and if there's a witnessing requirement, that has to take place. If it's a notary requirement, that has to take place. And then, of course, that security interest document, that mortgage instrument, needs to be delivered to the lender, just as a deed needs to be delivered to the grantee when the property is originally purchased. Who are parties to this mortgage instrument? Well, you have a mortgagor and a mortgagee. The mortgagor is the person that's probably just bought the property and now they're turning right around and putting an encumbrance on it or deeding it out to that trustee or if it's a security interest, sending it right back to the lender. I have the word, so the mortgagor is going to be your borrower. I also have the word grantor here because like on the deed of trust or the security deed, that's a deed instrument in and of itself. So the borrower there is going to be called the grantor, whereas when they were receiving the property from their original seller, in that deed they were called the grantee. But on this mortgage document, they may in fact be called the grantor because they're granting out the property to someone else. The mortgagee, of course, that will be the lender. Mortgagor, mortgagee. Those are your parties. Okay, so let's put all this together and see how the transaction works. We've got three situations here. On this panel, this is a cash transaction. Very simple. The seller has the property. Seller's going to give the buyer a warranty deed. And the buyer's going to give cash to the seller. Almost as easy as what I say in my classes, almost as buying tomatoes at the grocery store. You walk in, hey, I want this piece of property. Okay, here's the deed for the property, give me the money. It's going to be a little bit more complicated than that, but as far as the financing is concerned, that's quite simple. Okay? The only document you have here is the warranty deed, typically. Okay, but what if you don't have all the money? You got to borrow it. You got to borrow it from a mortgage company or a bank. We call that third-party financing. So here, it gets a little bit more complicated. This is on the financing end of it. Seller gives a warranty deed to the buyer, just like in the last example, except this warranty deed is going to have extra wording that creates a lien on the property saying, well, you don't own, I'm deeding the property to you, but you don't own it totally until you pay off the lien, pay off the debt that you're incurring on this. So the seller gives a warranty deed to the buyer. Buyer typically will give some sort of down payment in cash to the seller. But where's the rest of the money going to come from? From the lender. So the lender gives the seller the rest of the money. Well, the lender's just not going to do that without what? the promissory note. The buyer has to promise the lender, I'll pay you back. It's an IOU. This is the promissory note or the real estate lend note. So the buyer signs the note and gives it to the lender. These are the two parties on that document. But then if this is we'll say this is in the state of Texas, there's a deed of trust typically involved here. And so the buyer will turn right around and execute what we call a deed of trust to the trustee, who will hold the property only so as to foreclose on it in the event, and only in the event, the buyer doesn't pay the note. Okay? And then, of course, when the 30 years later, 20 years later, whenever the note is paid off, one more document. It's going to be the lender sending right back to the buyer some sort of release of lien. And that's the way that works. Last example. Seller finance, except here you don't have a lender. You've got the buyer promising the seller in the note that they pay him back, but you still have a trustee that works on behalf of the seller. But other than that, everything remains the same. So that's the seller carrying the note rather than an outside lender. And that's an overview of real estate finance.